Doesn't do it.
Maybe it's just deaf. It's here.
No. Oh yeah, maybe.
Yeah. Try it.
Hi guys, in the back. Can you hear me? Okay, good. All right, let's get started because as you know, we always have a class at 1, so we got to be out in time. So it's my distinct pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Professor Janet Rich-Edwards from Harvard University. It is such an honor and pleasure for me because Janet and I went through the PhD program together at Harvard. So we've been long-standing colleagues. In fact, we were both shocked this morning when we noticed we know each other for 30 years. I don't know whether that's good or bad, but Janet is one of the most thoughtful epidemiologists I've ever met. And that's why it's been such a pleasure to share an office with her at Harvard for several years. And that's why I invited her here today, because she has an incredible expertise in a number of areas that are of interest to many of us. One is social disparities. She has an interest in domestic violence. There's a lot of research on that, and many of us are interested in that here. She also has a particular interest in life course epidemiology, which is Dr. Maieda's expertise as well. Both Professor Rich-Edwards and I did our thesis actually on a life course topic, so I think she's touching on many of these different areas. So I'm very grateful that she made the way here. Of course, I invited her in January because of the Boston grim weather. And so I was sure she was going to accept our invitation if I was to invite her in January or February. Of course, it's not really that warm here now, so I had to apologize for that. But thank you, Janet, for coming and for joining us today. And her topic today is How Did the Elephant Get in the Room? Pathways from Child Abuse to Adult Chronic Disease. And as a side note, we are taping this lecture because I have to actually go and talk to the dean for a little while, and I may not catch the entire talk. So if you enjoy the talk and you have a colleague you want to refer to, it will be on the Epi website later. So thank you, Jenna, and welcome.
Thank you. Thanks, Karen, for inviting me. I love that you guys are complaining about the weather. It's hilarious if you're from Boston. It's really nice out. I'm really excited to be here because you guys really represent some experts in social determinants of health and in life course approach. And so I'm interested in keeping my remarks as short as I can so that we have some time to really discuss how you approach, particularly the idea of intervention around social determinants of health. And in fact, I thought, I kind of misnamed this. It's not so much how did the elephant get in the room, thinking about child abuse as an exposure, but more how do we get the elephant out of the room? What can we do next? So I'm going to talk a little bit, do a little bit of theory on life course approach to chronic disease and some in particular of the challenges we see with causal inference work. Talk, of course, about the prevalence of violence against girls and women, show you how we approach it with the Nurses' Health Study, talk a little bit about what associations we see between child abuse and cardiometabolic disease in adulthood, and then really open up to the question of what's next. So this is bringing sand to the beach. You guys, I think, all know this stuff, but this is the life course epidemiology definition I work with most, which is this idea that we're studying the long-term effects of physical or social exposures that occur throughout the life course, starting perhaps in gestation, but going the whole way, to elucidate biological, behavioral, psychosocial processes that, again, operate across the life course or even throughout generations. And where here, if you're looking at, here's a life course, where sort of before this idea, we're really only, like you're taking a look at women's health, and you're looking at cardiometabolic disease and maturity, we were really only looking at factors that were sort of occurring at or soon after menopause as predictors. And then in the 80s, I think several people get credit, but David Barker in particular began to ask questions about, well, what about this perhaps most sensitive time in our life when we're developing the fastest, which is in utero? What about factors there? How do they affect health decades later? And then, of course, the developmental origins of health and disease, which really is a bit more of a focus on childhood and adolescence. And when you're looking at child abuse, of course, it fits right in that framework. So some features of a life course approach are, of course, social, biological, psychological chains of risk. One risk factor tends to lead to another one. The idea of latency, that something, an exposure in one time period, may not be manifest for years or decades later. The idea of embodiment, particularly that we take psychosocial exposures that get into our very physiology. As part of that, the question of, are we talking about plasticity? How much do our bodies and our psyches adapt to these exposures? Can they adapt back? Versus programming, which is, of course, the idea that you have an exposure or an insult, sometimes a toxic insult, that might actually set, particularly if it happens early in life, sort of homeostatic mechanisms and other physiological traits, for better or worse. The idea, of course, of critical periods, critical windows for exposures. We think a lot about trajectories and turning points in health over life, vulnerability and resilience, and health development. So not only what are the toxins, that we get exposed to over life, but what are the factors that actually promote positive health development? That's all very well, but we have to model this eventually. And so there are several models that we think about when we think about life course approach. The most simple of these is a simple accumulation model, where you've got independent exposures that accumulate over time to culminate in your outcome measure, your usually disease. And in this case, if this is your model, you could intervene on any of these. You'd probably have to intervene on all of them, but it wouldn't matter when you did it particularly, right? So that's a very simple model. A model that's getting a little bit more realistic when we're talking about social determinants is the idea that you have accumulation, but the risks themselves are clustered. And the classic black box here is socioeconomic clustering. So when you think about where are you going to intervene in this kind of model, you probably want to intervene at the root cause of the other causes, okay? Easier said than done. We're talking about revolution here very often. Then there's this idea of chain of risk, a trigger effect, that one risk factor leads to another, leads to another. And here you can see it wouldn't much matter where you intervened. If you intervened anywhere and were able to block that pathway, you would prevent the disease. But that's too simple, of course. Here's a chain of risk model where you have both independent effects and mediating effects. And here it would make a difference. If you intervene here, obviously, you'd still get the disease through pathways A or B. You're much better off backing up upstream to intervene at an earlier point in the process. And then we get the whole catastrophe, vastly simplified, where you've got direct effects and indirect effects and moderating and mediating effects. But even this is far too simple. We need something more like complex systems modeling. This is some work by Anna Diaz-Ru looking at parental social environment and going through various processes to offspring health. And what you see here, for example, are examples of reinforcing loops, where here you've got parent-child feedback. And so this is happening over time, right? Or you get balancing feedback cycles, where here, for example, the offspring who have a certain either plastic or programmed response to stress avoid that stress, creating a different kind of causal pathway. And of course, the whole thing, that was supposed to, I worked on that this morning. That was supposed to go like running around all the circles. Of course, it's a much bigger mess than all of that. And we have a lot of challenges. In systems that are dynamic, that have recursive reinforcing and balancing feedback cycles over a lifetime, you have dependencies between individuals and, of course, their social context. And we're getting closer to real life, if you will. But perhaps we're moving farther away from satisfying some of the requirements of causal inference to actually specify our models and our exposures and our outcomes in real time in ways that we can really infer cause, which is, of course, what we want to do if we want to pick the best kind of prevention and intervention strategies. So here's an example of a study that I think is one of the ones that probably got closer than many to showing sort of some real world complexity. And they were looking at how antisocial behavior at grade 10 was predicted at grade 8, grade 6, and grade 2. And you can see the domains they were looking across: the temperament, peers, school, family. And you can see how complicated that is, right? And you know this is probably even a simple model of reality. But this is about as complicated as you ever get. And you could imagine, you know, from this you could, if you wanted to prevent antisocial behavior, you know, intervene at this point, you know, fairly proximal to the outcome you're trying to influence. Or you could try to back it up and intervene earlier. Yes?
Do you know, what do the numbers on the arrows mean?
Oh, the numbers on the arrows are sort of the strength of the associations, if you will, yeah, between the various factors. If you try to find the spider in this web, it's really hard. What's the origin of all of this? And the closest you can come to, honestly, is probably low socioeconomic status. And so this provides both opportunities and challenges, right? You have opportunities in that you're identifying what the relationships are, and you can get some sort of prediction for, okay, if you're going to intervene here, what will happen? And what won't happen. So you get many more possibilities for prevention, to identify these proximal and distal intervention points. But imagine trying to do this study, right? This takes that was at least what, 8 years of observation and a very complex design and I think large numbers. It's very hard to get these kind of data, right? In the meantime, we have to act. So you get systems like this one, where overall, particularly if you're working in cohorts and you're looking retrospectively, which is a fair bit of work I do, looking at adult cohorts back to childhood exposures, the closer you get to your outcome, generally the easier it is to measure what you want to measure, and the further back you go, the harder to measure it becomes. But at the same time, the farther back you go, you know, if you go back and you disrupt the whole socioeconomic structure of the United States, well, that would be a big impact, right? Whereas if you're just looking at, say, you know, parental monitoring last year, that would probably be a fairly small impact. So these are the trade-offs we have as we think about our studies. And I'm going to talk about child abuse, okay, which sits somewhere, you know, in this complex web. So I give you that for context, and also for thinking about coming back at the end, for thinking about, you know, what then do we do? So, prevalence of violence against girls and women. I'm going to show you first just this slide from the National Violence Against Women Survey, which seems pretty dated. It was done in the mid-90s. A phone survey of 8,000 women and 8,000 men by the National Institute of Justice and the CDC, random digit dialing, female interviewers, English and Spanish. The reason why I'm showing you this fairly dated data is only in that first version of this survey did they actually ask about physical assault as a child by a caretaker. And what you can see overall here, these are the total reported physical assault, is that 40% of women report some physical assault before age 18 and 54% of men. Okay, just to get a sense of the scale of this. And you can see the detail in here. Most of it is slapped, hit, push, grab, shove, hit with an object. But you also have some pretty significant proportions of, say, beat up or threatened.
Where would spanking?
So spanking, I believe in this one is, I'll show you how we do it, and I think they do it the same way. Spanking for discipline, you mean? Yeah. I'll show you how we do that. So then what this group has done is they've continued to do intimate partner and sexual violence surveys at various periods, and the last one was 2015. So now, in this case, I'm showing you the data from 5,700 surveyed women around the country. And this is lifetime sexual violence, not just intimate partner violence. So this is at any point in your life from any perpetrator. 21% of American women will tell somebody on the phone that they have experienced completed or attempted rape. Okay? You can see from that statistic that most of it is completed forced penetration. But we also take a look at attempted rape. 16% report sexual coercion, which has a really long definition, which I won't repeat here, but is pretty much what you think it is. And 37% report unwanted sexual contact. Now this happens pretty early in women's lives. So here's the pie chart of age at first completed or attempted rape. And you can see that 43% were less than age 18, and another 39% 18 to 24. So this is happening fairly early in women's lives. And when you add up the statistics I showed you earlier with this, it means that fully 9% of all American women experienced a completed or attempted rape before they turned 18. So this is why I call it the elephant in the room. Because this prevalence of violence is really high. It's high by, whether you think of it as an absolute number or even when you think of it as relative to other countries. We have some of the higher rates of family violence in the world. And we don't talk about it in general. So this is why what interests me. A lot of people study the short-term implications of child abuse. I'm really interested in what happens over the life course of somebody, what happens over the long run. And so that's the question I'm addressing today. I have one, in many ways, really good resources to do this. Most of my work in this has been in the Nurses' Health Study cohorts. This is a group of now 3 cohorts. The oldest one was started in 1976 when investigators wanted to know what's the impact of the oral contraceptive on breast cancer risk. That was the origin of the first Nurses' Health Study. They have grown to be just incredibly pluripotent cohorts that I'm happy to answer questions about. Here's the genealogy of them. So in 1976, Nurses' Health Study 1, 121,700 married registered nurses. Why married? Because who has sex? In 1976, they thought that's who was going to be using the oral contraceptive. Whoops. So they started Nurses' Health Study 2 in 1989, which did not require that you be married. Women were aged 25 to 42 in 89. We have, since actually one of Karen's big initiatives within the Nurses' Health Study was going back to the mothers of the nurses to get information about their childhood. We also go to the children of the nurses in a study called the Growing Up Today study. And we now have started Nurses' Health Study 3, which is fully web-based, open cohort, so it's still enrolling, and trying to follow some of their kids too. So why study nurses? Very quickly, they have good medical training. We get very high quality information about their health from them. Not perfect, and for the most important outcomes like cardiovascular disease and cancers, we do go after medical records to confirm what they're telling us. More importantly, they understand research. They get what we're trying to do, which makes them motivated participants, and they're really great about returning their questionnaires and participating in sub-studies that collect biosamples. It's a very efficient cohort. So Nurses' Health Study 2 is what I'm mostly going to talk about today. Started in '89, mailed to nursing roles in 14 US states, 100% female. This is the rub. It is 93% white. That's who was on the nursing rolls in 1989. So the way this works, it's a prospective cohort study. We send them questionnaires every 2 years. You can see there, every questionnaire has things like environmental exposures, incident diseases, weight, smoking, things of that nature. But every questionnaire has sort of like its little sort of specialty. And in 2001, we were able to send out a questionnaire asking women to recall their experiences of violence throughout their lives, which allows us to look retrospectively at things that happened before 2001 at the risk of some recall bias, and prospectively. We'll also be talking later about food addiction and PTSD, which we have measured as well. We get bloods at various points and are currently collecting fecal and oral samples, which gives us the potential to do microbiome work. So, the Nurses 2 Violence Questionnaire. It took us 7 years, me and Roz Wright, to convince the study investigators that it would be all right to try this, to ask the women about their experiences of violence. What were they worried about? Well, they were worried about the safety of the women, fair enough, but they were also worried that women would be insulted that we were asking and would drop out of the cohort. And as you all know, the mark of validity of a prospective cohort study is keeping everybody in there. So we did a pilot study, nobody dropped out, and they allowed us to mail to 91,000 of the respondents who typically responded after one questionnaire mailing. So we did that. We got 75% response for one mailing, which is actually very good. It usually takes us, 5, 6, 7 mailings to get all our responses in. That makes this cohort 7 times the next largest violence cohort that has health data. So this is a really valuable resource. And the follow-up, as you might imagine, because these are actually already our good participants, but we have over 98% response rate from the women on whom we have the violence histories taken in 2001. So we get physical, sexual, and emotional experiences of violence. We get developmental stage, childhood, adolescence, adulthood, severity, and cumulative experience. And here are the instruments we use to do that. So this is the classic physical abuse scale, the conflict tactics scales. And you can see there that it asks about fairly objectively defined acts, right? It's not saying, were you physically abused? Which is a very, very hard question to answer, right? But instead it asks, did somebody do this to you and how often? That top question, the spank you for discipline, is what we call a cleaner question. It's there so that people who don't know where to put, they may have been spanked for discipline, but they don't want to say somebody hit you. They can put that experience there. So there's a little bit of, there's some interpretation, as you can see, by somebody filling this out, but it's meant to be as objective as possible. I've always thought it would actually be very interesting to analyze what spank you for discipline had to do with later health, but we've never done that. So we use the other questions here. This is asked for childhood and adolescence, and then the sexual abuse survey asks separately about sexual touching by an adult or older child, or forced to touch when you did not want to, and then forced sex here. And so we get whether that didn't happen, happened once or more than once. So here's the proportion who experienced physical or sexual abuse. In the interest of time, I'll spare how we can sort of do some factor analysis to define mild, moderate, severe levels of abuse. So you see here that 46% of women report absolutely no abuse, which means that 54 do, which is higher than what you saw in that National Violence Against Women survey. You may recall it was 40%. So we're seeing more than that survey. Kaiser has also done some of this work with a survey method similar to ours, and they come up with numbers that we're a little higher than that, but pretty close to the Kaiser numbers. Where we sort of see the excess is mostly in the mild. So our measures of severe abuse come out looking pretty much like the national averages. And then here's for sexual abuse. And you can see here that most women happily do not experience any of it, but fully 12% of women report experiencing forced sex once or more than once before age 18. Overall, if you look at severe abuse as either severe physical abuse or forced sex, 17% of the cohort, which a lot of people have experienced severe abuse in childhood. So what are the correlates of that abuse? So this is, I could do a whole lecture on this particular slide and what this might mean. So this is complicated. This is looking at the education of the participant's father and mother, so mean level in years of education by severity of abuse. And you can see this very clear dose-response association, so that those who have more severe abuse exposures are more likely to have parents with less education. That doesn't mean that less education causes abuse. You don't know which comes first in these kinds of associations, right? It could be that if you have less education as a mother, you have fewer options for getting out of an abusive situation. So we really don't know what the directionality is here, but it is here nonetheless, and it's something we need to grapple with in our modeling. Interestingly, maybe should have seen this coming, but this is one that surprised me when we first saw it. This is the prevalence of diabetes in the parents of our nurse participants by the abuse severity. I'm only showing you physical abuse in the interest of time. Sexual abuse looks almost identical. So you see those women with a history of moderate or severe child abuse also have parents more likely to themselves have diabetes. It's type 2 diabetes. Not much going on with alcohol. That's sort of drinking a lot of alcohol, but you do see the cigarette smoking also associated with severity of abuse. This will become important later. No association with adult exercise. Women with a history of abuse are no less likely to exercise vigorously than women without. And this one, so what are you going to do if you want to understand body mass index in childhood? And your cohort is age 25 to 42, right? You can't ask them what they weighed at age 5 or age 10 or age 15. So we use this Stunkard scale. And you've got these profiles, and you're asked at various ages to rate what your profile was. And you say, this is ridiculous, particularly for age 5. But I will say that this measure, even at age 5, predicts age at menarche. So there is some meaning to it. What you see here is that it is not associated with the likelihood of reporting child abuse. Okay? Which becomes something of a baseline for our inference, because what you see here is their body mass index at age 18 is already starting to diverge a bit by their abuse history, and by the time the cohort actually starts in 1989, you see a clearer trajectory, and then when we look over their lives, during our follow-up time, you can see that those who have the more severe forms of abuse are at the top line, and those body mass indices begin to diverge and continue to diverge over the life course. We are not the first to observe this. Here is obesity risk, a meta-analysis across several studies, and you can see overall those with a history of child abuse have about a 30% increased risk of being obese as adults. So where does this lead? You can probably guess where we're going next, and that is diabetes. Okay, so we looked, this is follow-up, this is sort of early work for us. We've looked at follow-up from 1989 through 2005, so those participants were 40 to about 60 by the end of this follow-up. We had over 2,000 cases of incident type 2 diabetes. 760 of those cases were after 2001, so were prospective. But when we looked at the association of abuse with sort of retrospectively and prospectively, we saw no difference. So I think we felt fair combining them. And this is what we saw. Here's physical abuse. You see, a 50% increased risk of diabetes in those with severe abuse, 30% with those with moderate physical abuse in childhood. This is adjusted for age, race, parents' history of type 2 diabetes. You'll remember that association we saw earlier, that body type at age 5, and parental education. Adult body mass index accounts for about 60% of this association. So it's the most important mediator, as you might imagine, having seen the earlier associations of abuse history with BMI. Here's sexual abuse, dose response association right there. And in the case of sexual abuse, adult BMI accounts for about 64% of the association. So one of your major pathways from child abuse to type 2 diabetes is traveling through body mass index. So we've also, and where body mass index goes, so goes hypertension. We've done papers on hypertension that look very similar. So this is looking at cardiovascular events, which are self-reported by the nurses, but then verified by medical record review. And in this case, through 2007, we had 513 cases of myocardial infarction and stroke. Again, the retrospective and prospective looks were very similar. And here's what you see. What I was surprised at this point, having seen the diabetes and the hypertension associations, is the lack of dose response. So we see this 50% increased risk with severe physical abuse history, but nothing going on with moderate, nothing at all. In this case, we looked at a bunch of adult risk factors, which accounted for almost 80% of the association. A lot of that was BMI. And then similarly, looking at sexual abuse for sex also has the elevated hazard ratio, but sexual touching really was nothing. And again, adult risk factors accounted for most of the association. So then we're in a situation where I'd like to fill in this pathway, right? We've got histories of child abuse, we've got kind of cardiometabolic disease in adulthood. We already know that quite a lot of it travels through overweight and obesity. So what drives this association? Is it socioeconomic position? Doesn't really look like it. We've controlled for parental education, and they're all registered nurses, right? So they're already in a fairly narrow band of socioeconomics, right? So it doesn't appear to be that. It doesn't appear to be that they're getting less exercise. As you saw, it was completely flat, that association of abuse history and exercise. So in our cohort, at least, that's not explaining why the excess BMI. Is it a bad diet? You know, is it a lot of junk food? Well, we've got food frequency questionnaires, which are pretty adequate to the task, and it doesn't look as though women are eating different things. They're not eating different foods, but we do see something else. And I'm going to show this. Cite the memoir of Roxane Gay. Have any of you read Hunger? It's a spectacular memoir. It's intimate, it's vulnerable. Roxane Gay is just brilliant. And it was very generous of her, I think, to give her account of having been raped at age 12 by a gang of boys and how that has affected her throughout her life. And in particular, her relationship with food. So she says, I know what it means to hunger without being hungry. It's in the mind and body and heart and soul. And she, in her account, describes her experience of feeling ravenous even if she's not hungry. That sense of fullness that you normally would get from eating goes away, and all she feels is sick, but still she eats. She feels guilt and uncontrollable self-loathing and keeps eating to soothe those feelings and strangely to punish myself, she says. That sounds like torture, but it's actually very common. And a number of researchers have come up with various phenotypes of this kind of disordered, dysregulated appetite. Non-appetitive eating, coping motivated eating, you've probably heard of, loss of control eating, sometimes binge eating, and food addiction. These are all overlapping phenotypes. It's almost as if for every researcher you get a measure, and sometimes I wonder if they're actually separate phenotypes. But the one we have in the Nurses' Health Study is the food addiction scale, the Yale Food Addiction Scale. And you can see what some of those items are like. Basically distress about eating and food and what you're eating, and changing your behavior and your life because of different concerns around eating. To get scored as being food addicted, you have to answer at least 3 of these sort of circled ones, and at least 1 of these 2, which is causing significant distress, or the food and eating decrease your ability to function effectively. So 8% of our cohort of Nurses' Health Study 2 scores positive for food addiction. And when you look at that by abuse history, you see it light up as a total dose-response association, so that those who experience the highest levels of abuse are experiencing 16, 20% of food addiction. So it's really quite prevalent. And that's something that we are interested in digging into more, because as much as like at face value we all think, oh yeah, people eat to deal with stress, it's not really obvious why that should be so if you step back and think about it, right? It's so common, we just sort of take it as given, but there may be physiologic mechanisms that link this early trauma to a disordered, dysregulated appetite, and that's some of the stuff we're interested in pursuing next. So here we are, we're trying to put in another link in this chain, but back to these, what are our models? Very aware that this stuff is over a lifetime, right? And we know that BMI will actually affect your appetite. And so for somebody who's trying to study something prospectively that happened in childhood, it's very hard to know when this happened. So the difficulty of actually trying to specify a causal model becomes a real challenge. And then you'll ask, if you're paying attention, what about other aspects of mental health? So we have some measures of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and measures of depression throughout the cohort. And we are just now running these data. We've rerun the basic child abuse cardiovascular disease association now with data through 2015, so 10 more years of follow-up. It's almost uncanny that those relative risk, the hazard ratios you saw, are almost identical to what they were 10 years ago. Sometimes with longer follow-up, either due to regression to the mean or due to mounting risk factors in your unexposed. You sometimes see those things go away, but that wasn't true here. I actually wondered if maybe we'd see the moderate abuse show up with more statistical power, but it didn't. So it's still the severe abuse is associated. And the data I'm going to show you are from postdoc Anna Poon, who delivered her first child 2 days ago. So in a cohort where we've got questionnaire screens for PTSD, roughly 14% of the cohort screens positive in general for PTSD. But you can see here it's several times higher for those with a history of child abuse, severe child abuse. Similarly, depression, while about 40% of the cohort at some point in our follow-up reports depression, it is higher here for women who have histories of child abuse, as you might expect. And what we find when we do a mediation analysis is that a little over half of the association between severe abuse and cardiovascular disease in adulthood appears to be mediated by PTSD and depression. Okay? Now, I've already told you that over half of this association is mediated by BMI, right? And you know that when you look at individual mediating factors, you have to account for their overlap, or you will end up overestimating the amount that's mediated. So we're in the position now of thinking about, and PTSD and depression themselves, of course, over a lifetime also have sort of recursive associations with BMI. So we're trying to put this all together in one pathway, understanding that there are all these reinforcing loops over time. And this becomes really, really challenging. Like, how are you going to pick your line through all of this changing stuff that is all correlated in multi-directions? So if you know how to do it, tell me, because we're really struggling with it. So, in this sort of complex world where we've got things that are easier to measure and harder to measure, things with lesser impact and greater impact, we're researchers. We want to research. But I would argue to you that meanwhile, our house is on fire in this country. We see BMI going up. We see cardiometabolic disease going up, though we're doing a good job of treating much of it with statins and other things. But we know from the IOM report in 2013, shorter lives, poorer health, which I think to its credit made us this statement that the causal pathways linking early life health risk with subsequent disease may involve many aspects of development. They're basically describing that big hairy model. But at the end of the day, I think we go back to sort of Tolstoy's question, what then must we do? Given these really complex systems, where are we going to choose to intervene? Where would we be most effective? Where is there even any hope of changing things? What do we settle for? What do we aim for? And I'd say we have something of a conundrum, right? So our mission is to improve population health. We acknowledge a life course determination of population health. We acknowledge the potential power of correctly intervening on root causes, getting back to the upstream causes, right? But also the potential cost of intervening on non-causal factors. So it really behooves us to figure out what is causal and what is correlational. And the impossibility of obtaining all the data we would like to have for a sufficiently complex model for many public health problems. I think the question I would bring to you, that I think we all wrestle with, is how do we balance this imperative to correctly specify our causal models with the imperative to actually do something? So I'll leave with a bunch of questions that I would love to discuss with any or all of you. Should we keep studying these pathways, or do we know enough? Is it important for me, I want to look at, for example, the hormone ghrelin, the appetite controlling hormone that seems to, respond to stress exposures. Is it useful to do that? Or is that just sort of too proximal, or is it really the right thing to do? What in this web of factors can we claim as causal? Are we ready for interventions? At what causal juncture do we want to design interventions, and what would they look like? So I will open up for questions. Thank you for listening. This is the work of many people over a long period of time, and I really appreciate your attention. Thanks. Yes. Yes, we have, so the question you couldn't hear back there is, do we have data in the Nurses Health Study on medication for PTSD and depression? We do have antidepressants. So, when you're doing it in a cohort, it's not randomized, because you're always worried about sort of confounding by indication. So we always end up with a little bit of trouble, with that inference. But say more what you're thinking. What would you do with those data?
I wonder if it has any effect on the outcome variables such as BMI or the gradient leptin balance.
Yep. Yeah. Well, I think some antidepressants, not all, are pretty famous for increasing BMI. So I think without a doubt, that is a possibility. That's a really good question. And as we begin to dig into this, I will be sure to pay attention to that. Yeah, yeah. I wish I had relevant measures though to answer the other question. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you for that. I heard last week an announcement that ACE measures were going to be reimbursed in California in Medicare, $20 million for physicians to screen for adverse childhood experiences, which is a big step
Yes.
in this early detection. Thank you for posing the question about mediating pathways and spending too much time there versus the bigger picture. That's obviously the ongoing debate in the social determinants of health. I think with food addiction, disentangling the mechanisms, right, whether it's dopamine or HPA access or methylation sites, I think that evidence can really strongly help implicate the food industry in the food environment.
Interesting.
I believe that the food addiction data will create a strong basis by which we can intervene at the policy level at the food environment. Because if it's true that people have addiction like eating, it's going to really inform changes in the food environment. That data, I think, will be super important. So thank you for doing that work.
Honestly, I hadn't thought that much about that particular question and the food policy part of it. My thinking about sort of trying to trace down something like ghrelin and trying to figure out what the pathways is almost one of destigmatization.
Yes.
You know what I'm saying? That we do so much fat shaming, and to be able to take a look and do shaming about appetite too, and to be able to understand that these things are not just a matter of personal will, part of our bodies, and that those bodies are shaped by our experiences, I would hope would go away with understanding. I mean, we understand alcoholism differently than we did once upon a time. I think there are a lot of things that can change. You know, whether, you know, a ghrelin antagonist or something would ever be useful, as a public health person, my first impulse is not to go to medication. On the other hand, statins have saved a lot of lives. So I think there's a lot of questions about why would we want to try to disentangle that pathway. Yes.
Thank you so much for that insightful talk. I really appreciate it. This is quite well done. It gave me a lot to think about. I was wondering, as a result of all of this data, if the individuals involved in the study are being asked what they need or what they found helpful. Because just as a physician, I find that a lot of my patients in these kinds of issues, they kind of have a good idea of what might be helpful or something that has been helpful in the past, but I haven't seen personally any data that's a collective of what we could do. Because as a final, I guess, address to your last slide, I would say we would do both, like continue to research all the pathways, but then like we have the responsibility as professionals to give and advocate what's already working or what seems to be on the way. And so we push those solutions and then the science at the same time.
Thank you for that comment. And the answer to your question of whether we have that is yes and no. Another thing that Anna Poon, who when she comes back from maternity leave, is looking at is we have measures of coping strategies. We basically bin those strategies into sort of externally focused coping versus internally focused coping. And they are predictive of cardiovascular disease, and they're associated with child abuse histories. Although then we get really complicated about, you know, thinking about a family and where you learn your coping strategies and are they affected by the abuse, or are those coping strategies what actually leads to the abuse. It gets really hairy in terms of the causal model there, but we do have it, we will be looking at it. But no, we don't go to the nurses and ask them that specifically, you know, where we spontaneously generate it from there. Those questions may be better suited to smaller clinical studies, but I think those are really important questions because the next thing is, well, what would your intervention be? And to tap into the wisdom of the people who have these experiences, I think would be really helpful. Yes.
I guess my my question, like always, is like how reliable is like when you look at BMI and think is like that's the like normal, that's like overweighted and let's weight, like how would I trust it? It's just a number that tells me only ask for my weight and my height and then they know I'm normal. It's like it's kind of like how do I weigh the data from BMI and also like for example body type from the scale, it doesn't really, it's not really representative of all type of body because some people have like more likely to have like organ fat than like external fat. So it's like, and also I'm wondering if you have any like cognitive level, like how confident you are with your body, like those type of things that assess like mental health in relationship to like body weight and overweight.
Yeah, those are all really good questions. I think the first thing I would say is, you know, the difference between population level prediction and individual level prediction is something I think you all know from being here at the school. So what might be useful as BMI on a population level may or may not be particularly predictive for an individual, in part because of the very things you're talking about. You know, that you can be, you know, a super athlete and have really dense muscles and you'll have a high BMI, right? So we know there's a lot of misclassification with BMI for what we want to actually measure, you know, which is adipose tissue and its distribution throughout the body. But you can't obviously do that with 116,000 women. It's just infeasible. So we go with BMI. And so it's a proxy for, if you want, for what we really would like to get at, which is I think what you're talking about. But also bringing up, you know, BMI is a marker. I think you're bringing up a good point, not only for sort of physiological processes like increased inflammation much of being overweight or obese, how much of the ill effects of that are actually due to things like fat shaming, right? So it's hard to tease that out, but I think those are probably some of the next steps. Yeah.
I'm really sorry to cut it off, but I can hear the crowd outside.
Yes, I know.
And I think if you have any remaining questions, we can maybe step outside for a few minutes to ask them. But please join me in thanking Dr. Rich Edwards for a wonderful talk.
I have to talk to you, so,
Yeah.
because we're working on a bunch of this right now, and we're looking at a completely different analysis about what's going on. I don't think you need to target and do more causal model. I think that it's, what we're seeing is there's four syndemics going on right now: obesity, mental health, neurodevelopment, and they're all related. And it's has to do with we're going through a massive epidemiologic shift because the entire ecosystem is going from the agrarian age to the industrial age. People got sick, and we're doing the same thing's happening right now. And it's not about studying it because it's happening so rapidly.
By the time we study it, it'll move on.
Another 10 years as everything starts unraveling.
Hey, yep, we're all good. Sorry, in the future I can help you with the laptop.
But I'd love to talk to you because we're doing this thing called All Children Thrive, which is like working at a city level, sort of like what Renee is doing with the Vital Village, but we're looking at doing it at city level in 60 cities across the U.S. It's about whole ecosystems. So let's.
Okay, so let's keep talking. Yeah. Thanks for coming.
Good to see you.
You too. Thank you.
I'm a dietitian, third year PhD.